Some stories never made it into the history books. They lived only in the letters soldiers never sent, and in the classified reports no one read twice. This is one of them. In the dead of winter, on the Eastern Front, a German sniper raised his rifle, aimed for the enemy's head, and hesitated. What he found after that shot would question everything he'd been taught about loyalty, duty, and what it means to be human. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand why one photograph buried in the snow could break a soldier trained not to feel. The winter of 1943 swallowed the Eastern Front whole. Between the ruins of Kharkov and the endless white of the Ukrainian steppe, silence did most of the killing. Snow had muffled even the artillery. Frost coated the dead until they looked like statues left to guard the trenches. The Wehrmacht was in retreat, thin lines scattered across 1,000 kilometers of open country, and for many units, snipers were the only defense left. They worked alone, unseen, the last precision in a war that had become chaos. The man behind one of those scopes had been a hunter before he was a soldier. The forests of Bavaria had trained his eye long before the army did. The Heer's Scharfschützenschule, the Army Sniper School, had turned that patience into a weapon. He learned to breathe with the rhythm of a heartbeat, to see movement before it happened, to wait for hours without twitching a muscle. His rifle, a Karabiner 98K fitted with a ZF-39 scope, felt less like a machine than an extension of his hands. The instructors drilled into him that a sniper's mind must be colder than his trigger finger. "Don't see men," they told him. "See targets." But targets bled. They always had. He crouched now in a half-collapsed farmhouse overlooking a snow-choked valley. The walls were cracked, the windows long gone. A white sheet hung behind him to break his silhouette, as doctrine demanded. He had stacked 2 sandbags under his rifle to control the recoil. Through the scope, the world narrowed to one circle of glass and breath. The cold had frozen his eyelashes together more than once. He'd learned to blink slowly to keep them from breaking off. Down below, Soviet patrols moved like ghosts through the haze, gray against gray. He could tell by their gait who was new and who was weary. The new ones walked with heads high, still trusting in orders. The weary ones stayed close to the ground, already half-ghost themselves. He adjusted the focus ring on the scope. The glass cut through the fog. And there, 300 meters ahead, a Soviet scout stopped to adjust his rifle sling. A clean profile. The sniper exhaled. There was no hatred. There hadn't been for a long time. Hatred required energy, and out here energy was rationed more tightly than ammunition. He killed because that was what the uniform required, because the manual said 1 shot, 1 target. Because the sound of his rifle was the only proof he still existed. Each kill earned a mark in the report, a line on paper to justify another day alive. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the echo vanished into the snow like it had never been. Through the scope, he saw the Soviet fall backward, his rifle slipping from his hands, one arm reaching out for something that wasn't there. Then stillness. Just another body in a war already full of them. The sniper reached for his logbook and wrote the date, the range, the estimated rank. Probably an infantry private, no insignia visible. He tore a small corner from his ration paper and placed it under the bolt as he always did, a ritual reminder that even precision had a cost. The paper bore a faint smear of grease, the only warmth he'd see that day. Above him, the sky was the color of lead. Snow began again, falling sideways in the wind, covering everything. He looked through the scope once more, scanning for movement. The field was empty. silent, perfect. And yet, something inside him shifted. He couldn't name it. The shot had landed exactly as trained, but the silence afterward felt wrong, heavier. He stayed behind the rifle longer than usual, as if waiting for something to move, for the world to reset itself. It didn't. He pulled his scarf tighter, checked his watch, and prepared to move. Orders were to confirm kills when possible, to check insignia, retrieve documents, or maps. Another soldier might have ignored that in weather like this, but he followed orders the way a drowning man follows air. He slid his rifle's safety on, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped out into the open snow. The wind bit through his uniform. Every footstep crunched like glass. Ahead, the fallen Soviet lay half buried already, one hand frozen in the act of reaching. He walked closer, the dull steel of his Luger heavy on his hip, his breath a cloud in front of him. The frost had begun to form crystals along the man's collar. The face was young. Too young. Barely 18, maybe 19. The kind of face that still had home in it. He knelt beside the body. The rifle was a Mosin Nagant, the standard issue. Nothing unusual. But when he turned the tunic slightly, a folded piece of paper slipped from the breast pocket and landed in the snow. He picked it up, unfolding it with stiff gloves. It was a photograph. A woman and a child stood in front of a wooden fence, summer sunlight spilling across them. The woman was smiling, the child perched on her hip. The edges of the photo were worn, the creases dark with handling. For a moment, the sniper forgot the cold. He forgot the war. All he saw was the expression, the same gentle pride he had seen once in a photograph his own mother kept before the war, before the draft, before everything became frost and orders. The wind lifted the corner of the photograph and tried to carry it away. He pressed it back down with his gloved hand, but the paper stuck to the damp wool of his glove, refusing to let go. He stood there, holding it, unsure whether to return it to the man's pocket or keep it. For the first time in months, he couldn't decide what to do. He looked at the dead soldier's face again, then back at the photo. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, until both faces, one in paper, one in flesh, were dusted white and indistinguishable from the field around them. He didn't write anything in the logbook that night. Before the war, he was just another boy from the mountains of southern Bavaria, one of thousands who grew up hunting deer and fox to feed their families during the lean years after the Depression. By 17, he could track by footprints, read wind through grass, and tell distance by instinct. When the Wehrmacht came calling, that skill made him valuable. Hunters became marksmen. Marksmen became snipers. In 1942, the German army formalized sniper instruction through specialized schools known as Heeres-Scharfschützenschulen. Each candidate received a precision-modified Karabiner 98K rifle fitted with a 4x magnification ZUF-39 scope. Training manuals, Heeresdienstvorschrift, HDV, 240/2, outlined not just marksmanship, but fieldcraft, camouflage using natural terrain, shooting from concealment, and memorizing range tables by heart. Recruits were told that a sniper's job was as psychological as it was tactical. One bullet could paralyze a platoon if the enemy believed he was being hunted. At the school near Seitler Alp in Austria, instructors hammered home a single phrase: "You are not a soldier. You are a weapon." Empathy was a liability. Each exercise drilled patience. Crawl 100 meters in 2 hours, shoot once, retreat unseen. They studied wind, humidity, mirage distortion, and even the effect of barrel temperature on the bullet's drift. Fail to account for any of them, and your shot betrayed you. The course graduates returned to the front with a sniper's patch sewn on their sleeve, an eagle clutching a target in its talons, and an unofficial reputation, both admired and distrusted. Snipers operated alone, outside the chain of camaraderie. Even within their units, others gave them space, as though death itself traveled with them. They lived apart, ate apart, slept where no one else did. Their survival rate was among the lowest in the Wehrmacht. Soviet counter-snipers hunted them relentlessly. For this soldier, isolation came easily. His name, never recorded in official citations, was one of thousands buried in field reports labeled Scharfschütze, Eastern Front. He had entered the war in 1941 with Army Group South, pushing through the Ukrainian steppe toward Rostov. Back then, confidence was easy, orders were clear, victories frequent. But by 1943, after the loss at Stalingrad, everything changed. The advance turned into retreat. The front collapsed into frozen chaos. The sniper's skill, once used for offense, became the only thing slowing the Soviet pursuit. He was assigned to the 3rd Battalion of the 198th Infantry Division, a unit that had fought from the Crimea to the Dnieper. By late 1943, it was a skeleton, barely 40% of its authorized strength. Ammunition was rationed to 7 rounds per day. Snipers were expected to make every shot count. Their targets were enemy officers, machine gunners, and forward observers, men whose deaths could buy a few more hours for the retreating infantry. In his field diary, one of the few personal notes recovered after the war from units like his, entries from that winter are sparse. Most contain only ranges and weather. Snow, -20. Wind northeast. 1 shot. 280 meters. Confirmed. No emotion, no names. Only math. German sniper doctrine at that stage had evolved to mirror the Soviet method. The manual Merkblatt 25/4, Verhalten und Tätigkeit des Scharfschützen, Conduct and Activity of the Sniper, issued in 1943, instructed marksmen to operate in pairs, 1 shooter, 1 observer. But by then, many worked alone. Spotters had become luxuries. Few divisions could spare. The sniper carried his world in a bread bag, cleaning kit, spare bolts, 5 clips of ammunition, and, tucked at the bottom, the small black notebook where every confirmed kill was recorded. Each rifle was inspected daily. The Kar 98K, chambered in 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser, was capable of accurate fire beyond 800 meters. German manuals insisted on zeroing scopes to 100 meters, adjusting in 50-meter increments. In the freezing wind, metal contracted and optics fogged instantly. Soldiers rubbed candle soot on the glass to prevent reflection that could betray their position. By the time he reached the Eastern Front's snowfields near Dnipropetrovsk in early 1944, he had logged over 100 confirmed hits. His uniform bore the insignia of a Scharfschütze, a small oval patch on the right sleeve, granted after 20 verified kills. Records show only a few hundred men ever received the higher-grade silver sniper badge for 60 or more. But medals didn't matter anymore. The longer he fought, the less human the war became. His days blurred into a pattern of waiting, firing, recording. He learned to recognize Soviet snipers by the glint of their scopes and the way they used dummy helmets to draw fire. He respected them, especially those trained under Vasily Zaytsev's system, whose ghost still haunted the German army after Stalingrad. Sometimes, after hours of stillness, he would imagine voices, the ones he had silenced, returning in the wind. The military had a term for it, Kampfmüdigkeit, combat fatigue. But snipers couldn't afford fatigue. They were expected to outlast it. The reality of his world was one of endless vigilance. A sniper's greatest enemy wasn't the man in his sights. It was time. Every hour in the snow eroded the mind. Every kill was another layer of ice over conscience. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself that every Soviet he dropped meant fewer shells falling on his comrades. And yet, something in him began to shift. The longer he stared through that small circle of glass, the more it felt like looking into a mirror. Each face that appeared in his scope seemed younger, more familiar. Each target less like an enemy and more like someone waiting for the same letter home. He was still precise, still disciplined, still lethal. But inside, a crack was forming, one that training couldn't fill and orders couldn't seal. The winter deepened. The Soviet guns moved closer. And one morning, when the fog rolled low and the frost turned the ground to stone, he would line up his next shot and discover the truth that no manual had prepared him for. He watched the first movement like a tide changing. At first nothing, then a small dark shape breaking the white. A shoulder, the glint of a rifle barrel, a careless silhouette lowering into a shallow ditch. On the Eastern Front, against a blank horizon of snow and sky, any motion reads like a text. A hand lifts a shovel. A head bends to tie a boot. A soldier breathes and shows himself to the world. The sighting came through a circle no larger than a coin. The ZF-39 scope on his Karabiner 98K framed the man at roughly 280 meters, far enough that details blurred, close enough that a steady shot could finish the job. The scope was a simple 4x optic, common on Wehrmacht rifles after 1941, and the Kar 98K, chambered for the 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser round, was a dependable instrument when zeroed correctly and cleaned every night. He checked wind by watching the snow dust rise from the man's shoulders and guessed a light northeasterly. He estimated range by the man's apparent height in the scope reticle, an old trick from the schools, and dialed his elevation accordingly, counting every click in his head the way some men counted rosaries. Practice had taught him to breathe slow, to squeeze the trigger at the bottom of an exhale so the body gave him a steadier platform. The cold helped. It hardened the tendons and steadied the hand, until the cold had a way of loosening the mind instead. A twitch in a finger could mean a missed shot. A missed shot could mean the sniper was exposed. He waited until the man shifted to reveal the crown of his head, then touched the trigger and felt the rifle move under recoil. Through the scope, the target slumped and rolled. Confirmed. The radio in his trench clicked. Reports were checked. Ranges recorded. In those weeks, the front was a ledger of small victories and daily losses. Each confirmed hit was a line item that justified rations and bought breathing space for retreating companies. He marked the shot in the black notebook that never left his breast pocket. Date, range, conditions, confirmed. The record was business, not story. Orders, however, rarely remained with the shooter. His squad leader's voice came over the field line. Check the body. Take any papers. Pull back if the area's hot. Sometimes the dead carried maps, sometimes letters. In reconnaissance sectors, a captured map could be worth an artillery correction or a reroute for a whole battalion. An officer's note found in a pocket could change the next day's orders. They taught snipers that a bullet could buy time, but documents could buy lives. He moved carefully across the whitened ground, boots muffled with cloth, every motion measured to avoid a glint of metal or an imprint that a Soviet spotter could read. Snow hides and reveals in equal measure. It swallows footsteps and outlines bodies. He kept his pistol low for close work and his knife sharp for cutting. At 200 meters, The cold makes your fingers crabbed and stubborn. At 30 meters, it makes your reaction slow. He closed the distance not by running, but by folding his body into the drag of the landscape, down, forward, under the shadow of a broken sapling that stuck from the drift like a hand. The ditch where the man had fallen was shallow but fresh, pieces of white scattered with the dark of wool and leather. The smell of cordite was faint in the air, carried on a wind that already smelled like thaw. He crouched near the body and checked for life first, because in this war a man could look dead and still choke out a last order. The Soviet soldier's face was turned away, breath small and quick, then still. He was young, the cheek smooth beneath frost, the face not yet a map of hardship. The standard inspection, rifle, uniform, ID, was a mechanical routine. The man wore a brown tunic and, under his coat, a simple shirt. A shoulder strap with a worn shoulder board told nothing of rank. A search of pockets was official duty, tactical necessity. The soldier's hands moved on the fabric as if on their own. Lift collar, unzip pocket, feel for paper. His gloved fingers closed on something soft, a small rectangle wrapped in oilcloth. Paper in winter is fragile. It might be turned to shreds by salt and blood. He peeled back the cloth with the thumb he'd learned to keep clean and unfolded a photograph. It was the size of a cigarette card and black and white. A woman seated on a stool, a child perched on her lap, both smiling the way people smile for a camera because life insists they do. The paper stuck slightly from moisture, and the child's hand in the image curved like a question. The photograph was not a document of strategy or orders. It carried no coordinates, no enemy dispositions, no military plan. Only a face that would not be on any map. In the manualized world he had been trained for, such a photograph should be dismissed as distraction. Sniper Doctrine, HDV, 240/2 and the field sheets that followed it, repeated the soldier's work in cold verbs: identify, engage, confirm, report. The human came later, in a line on a ledger or in a paragraph of a report. Empathy was a flaw. Efficiency demanded it. For a long breath he held the photograph with his mittened hand and felt something tug at the habit of killing. An image that looked like a letter from home. The snow around him neutralized sound. Even the distant thud of mortars seemed polite today. The photograph warmed to his glove like a body might. He did what his training never said to do. He turned the picture to look at the two faces one more time. The rational mind makes a list. The photograph could be evidence, maybe part of a partisan network. A coded message folded into a child's laugh. It could be nothing at all. He had no authority to keep it. Yet he felt the damnable urge to tuck it into his own pocket, an act that was both theft and mercy. He slid the picture into a crack in his kennikin, under a scrap of lint so that it would not be noticed in a cursory sweep. He stood, body stretched slow as a shadow, and looked back across the white to his own lines. The exchange of men's faces had been brief and strangely private. Snipers on both sides took trophies, dog tags, combs, even cigarette cases, but trophies were usually metal and easy to count. A photograph of a woman and child fit awkwardly into that ledger. It didn't increase a unit's combat value. It only complicated a man's thinking. Orders still ruled. He bent to do the other tasks. Photograph logged, cartridge casings collected, the body dragged into a hollow for temporary concealment from scavenging wolves and enemy patrols. He checked pockets again for maps, for notes, for anything that mattered. Nothing. The man was a reconnaissance private, not an officer. No map, no directive, no military puzzle. Back in his hide, the image did not leave the edge of his thoughts. When he took a drink of the canned coffee they passed around in the shell hole, the photograph's faces swam behind the cup rim. He found himself watching the horizon, not for movement of men, but for the shadow of a child in the snow. An impossible echo. That night, the wind sang through the foxhole, and his breath fogged the tiny circle of the scope as if the lens itself remembered. He recorded the kill in his book, range, wind, confirmation, as he always did. Under the entry, he made a line, the way he sometimes underlined the weather if it had been particularly bad. This time, the line felt different, a margin he had not known before. The next morning, the man's image sat in a corner of his mind like a foreign coin. The front did not wait for conscience to settle. Patrols needed covering. Orders to hold passed from colonel to lieutenant to corporal, as though the whole chain of command were a single machine. He checked his rifle and the level of oil in the cleaning rag. The logistics of survival reasserted themselves: food, ammunition, cover. Snipers were instruments of delay now, not of glory. Each shot shaved minutes from an advancing column. But that photograph had done something the manuals did not account for. It blurred the black line between target and human. The sight of the woman and child in the dead man's pocket stuck in his throat and made the next decision, about where to shoot, about when to fire, heavier than it had to be. When the spotter across the trench called out movement 200 meters to the left, the muscle memory returned. He brought the scope up, fixed the reticle, and breathed. The target moved, and this time, with the photograph folded somewhere against his ribcage, he fired. The shot rang out, and the scope's crosshair found another face. The ledger gained another line. There are thousands of similar entries in war diaries from that winter: shot, distance, condition. But that day, in a way no report would record, a small photograph had traveled from one man's pocket to another's mind and left a mark like a bruise. It would not stop the war. It would not change the orders. But it would change one man's practice. The careful way he checked a body, the hesitation before recording a kill, the small kindnesses he would henceforth permit himself when he could afford them. He closed the notebook and slid the pen into its slot. In the frozen light, he thumbed the edge of a photograph he no longer carried in his hand, but could not forget. The snow around him swallowed the noise of the front like a great white mouth. Everything returned to its work, waiting, watching, firing. Yet he had seen something in the pocket of an enemy that the training could not justify and the doctrine could not explain. Another life, fragile and private, that a bullet had ended. He would carry that small, illicit proof until winter's thaw. At first, it was just another order: check the body, collect the map, confirm the kill. That was all the army required. But when he turned the young soldier's coat aside, what he found stopped him more effectively than a bullet ever could. The photograph, now thawing slightly in his gloved hand, refused to let go. It clung to the damp wool like it wanted to live. The man he'd shot, barely old enough to shave, had carried this picture through the same snow, through the same fear, through the same war. His hands shook not from cold, but from something deeper. Recognition. He'd seen countless dead men, but none of them had felt this human. The Soviets were supposed to be faceless, just another wave in the endless red tide sweeping west. That's what the officers drilled into them. The enemy wasn't a man. He was an ideology. Yet here, in his hands, was proof that the enemy laughed once, loved once, lived once. He turned the photo over. The back carried faint Cyrillic writing in pencil, Just a few words, smudged by sweat and time. Later research would reveal that countless Soviet soldiers carried similar keepsakes into battle. Red Army regulations technically forbade personal effects that could identify family members if captured, but most ignored the rule. In the archives of Tsamo in Podolsk, hundreds of recovered field photos show the same thing: wives, mothers, children. The war might have erased their names, but it couldn't erase the need to remember them. German snipers were trained to suppress empathy. The Heeres-Scharfschützenschule curriculum warned against humanization of the target. Instructors even quoted Clausewitz, "Pity is a weakness exploited by the enemy." Yet all the manuals in the Reich couldn't prepare a man for this, a moment when doctrine and humanity collided in the snow. He looked down at the boy's face again. The eyes had frozen half open, lashes rimmed with ice. Somewhere in those eyes, he saw his own reflection through the scope, a man whose life had narrowed to crosshairs. The wind pushed across the steppe, shifting snow over the two of them like the war trying to bury its own shame. In his mind, training replayed like a machine. Confirm kill, take documents, return to post. But another voice, quieter, older, the one from before the uniform, asked him what this boy's mother would see if she were standing here now. Historians today call this kind of moment cognitive dissonance under duress. In studies of snipers from both sides, military psychiatrists later recorded identical symptoms: tremors, insomnia, recurring dreams of faces seen through scopes. Wehrmacht medical records from 1944 list sniper fatigue as a subtype of combat neurosis. Soviet doctors described it as moral paralysis. Both meant the same thing: when a soldier realizes his enemy is not an enemy at all. He knelt there until the snow covered the boy's boots. He knew standing too long risked exposure, yet he couldn't leave. Around him, artillery thundered in the distance, each blast folding into the next. The front was alive again, the world moving on without him. Still, he stayed. In the end, he placed the photograph back into the boy's pocket. Then, after a long pause, he took it out again. His hands betrayed him. He slipped it into his own coat instead. For the first time since the war began, he broke regulation. Not out of greed or curiosity, but because part of him needed to believe the picture would survive. When he returned to his post that night, his spotter asked, "What took you so long?" He didn't answer. That small photograph stayed with him for months, creased, faded, hidden under the lining of his tunic. Every time he lifted his rifle to the glass, it felt heavier, as if the weight of that picture hung from the barrel. The manuals said snipers fight best when they forget what they're fighting for. But that day, he couldn't forget. Across the snow, on the other side of the line, another rifle waited. Different uniform, same cold. Soviet sharpshooters called themselves snapery, and by 1943 they were as feared as they were indispensable. Many had been trained in the same kind of precision schools the Germans had built, but theirs carried a different scripture. Soviet sniper manuals told recruits to remember every bullet was for the motherland. Killing was framed as duty, not crime. Yet the diaries that survived tell a quieter truth, one that sounded very much like his. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the famous Soviet sniper who tallied over 300 kills, once admitted in a post-war interview that she still saw the faces of the first two men she shot. She said it felt like pulling the trigger on herself. Vasily Zaytsev, the hero of Stalingrad, wrote in notes of a sniper that he avoided looking through his scope at the moment of death because, if you see their eyes, they stay with you. They were told to view the enemy as animals, but the battlefield kept reminding them otherwise. By 1943, the Red Army had begun mass-producing pamphlets to harden its snipers. One, issued to the 62nd Army, stated plainly, "The fascist is not a man. He is a disease to be removed." Yet psychological reports archived at TSAMO later revealed something contradictory. After long campaigns, Soviet marksmen began to experience what commanders called odvraćanje, revulsion. They hesitated, missed deliberately, or requested reassignment to regular infantry. One NKVD summary from February 1944 reported that even the best lose aim after too much killing. The German sniper couldn't know any of this, of course, but what happened inside him was mirrored in thousands of others wearing the same fear in different languages. Soviet snipers, too, carried photographs in their tunics, letters from mothers wrapped in oilcloth, icons of saints tucked into helmets. A captured Red Army sniper near Kharkov in early 1944 had a small Orthodox cross around his neck and a photo of his wife sewn into his uniform lining. When interrogated, he said it was his way of seeing home through the sight. War makes men believe they're unique in their suffering, but on the Eastern Front, individuality dissolved under the snow. Both sides were told they were fighting monsters, and both sides discovered the same thing. Monsters bled, prayed, and wrote home. Modern historians examining sniper correspondence found this mirrored emotion again and again. In Josef Allerberger's memoirs, a German sniper described finding a dead Russian's field diary. Its final entry read, "If I must die, let it be facing east, not west." The German who read it refused to burn it, keeping it in his pocket until the war ended. On the Soviet side, recovered journals from snipers around Kursk record similar acts, burying fallen Germans, returning watches, or placing helmets over faces. The enemy's humanity had become a quiet contagion, spreading beneath the war's machinery. Neither command wanted it, but both lines of trenches were haunted by it. That winter, while the German sniper tried to forget the face of the boy he had shot, somewhere a Soviet marksman was kneeling over another fallen man, realizing the same unbearable truth, that they were reflections, not opposites. The next mission came 3 days later. Snow still covered the ridges like ash, and the air had the same bitter stillness, the kind that made sound feel heavier. Orders arrived at dawn. Soviet scouts had been spotted near the tree line east of their position. The sniper and his spotter were to take position along the ridge and intercept them. Standard work. Simple. But when he looked through his scope, something inside him refused to focus. The glass framed another face in the distance, a soldier kneeling to light a cigarette. The moment was perfect. The wind was calm. The range was exact. Yet his finger froze. The spotter whispered, "Take the shot." He didn't. He adjusted, waited, and when the target stood up, he deliberately let the sight drift wide. The shot cracked through the air, harmlessly striking snow behind the man. The Soviet soldier ran for cover. His spotter cursed, assuming it was a bad calculation. But he knew it wasn't. It was choice. That night, the silence between them stretched. The spotter said nothing, but the look in his eyes said what every sniper feared. That hesitation was infection. Once it started, it spread. Psychiatrists studying captured Wehrmacht snipers years later would call this moment Zielmüdigkeit, target fatigue. Reports in the Heer Sanitätsberichte archives from late 1944 describe it as a progressive moral exhaustion found in long-serving marksmen. Symptoms included tremors, nightmares, emotional detachment, and eventually refusal to fire. One report from the 11th Army recorded that 1 in 6 trained snipers were quietly reassigned due to this breakdown. He didn't know those numbers, but he felt their truth. Each night, when he closed his eyes, the boy's face reappeared. Frozen. Eyes open. That photograph, like a shadow, burned into his memory. The scope became a mirror. Every reflection was his own. His performance began to slip. Missed shots. Longer pauses. His commanding officer noticed. "You're thinking too much," the man said, a phrase lifted straight from the sniper manuals. Thinking, in war, was a liability. But the more he tried not to think, the louder the memory became. He started dreaming in flashes, rifle bolts clicking, snow melting into red, and always that photo fluttering in the wind. Combat fatigue wasn't new to the Wehrmacht, but snipers were especially vulnerable. Unlike infantry, who fought in chaos, snipers lived in isolation. Hours, sometimes days, without speaking, just listening for breath. The act itself demanded intimacy. You had to watch a man live before you could watch him die. That intimacy was eroding him. By the third mission after the incident, his spotter realized the truth. The rifleman had begun missing on purpose. One morning, when the Soviets advanced across open ground, the spotter lined up his own shot and whispered, "I'll do it." But the sniper put his hand over the barrel. "No," he said quietly. "Let them pass." In that moment, the war shifted for him. He wasn't fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to keep the last part of himself that still felt human. When he returned to base that evening, his superior noted his silence but said nothing. Snipers were valuable. As long as he still showed up, no one asked questions. That night, he opened his field pouch and took out the photograph again. He stared at it until the edges blurred, and for the first time, he realized he didn't even know why he had kept it. Guilt? Grief? Or something that had no name left in him. Outside, the wind carried the sound of artillery rolling across the plains. Inside his head, a single thought repeated with the rhythm of his heartbeat. If he had a photo like this, someone must have mine. He couldn't sleep anymore. Every sound outside the dugout, a creaking branch, a boot step, the whistle of wind across barbed wire, snapped him awake. His hands still remembered the motion of chambering around, but the will to pull the trigger was gone. Instead, he wrote, "On a night when frost coated the oil lamp and his breath fogged the paper, he began a letter to his mother back in Bavaria. The words came out uneven, broken by pauses where he stared too long at nothing. He wrote that the front had grown quieter, that the cold was manageable, and that he was healthy." Then the lie stopped. His handwriting tightened, and the next lines bled through the page. "I no longer know what side I am on," he wrote. "They tell us the Russians are beasts, but I have seen their faces. They look like ours. One even had a photograph of a child. Maybe mine will end up the same way, inside another man's pocket." He hesitated before signing his name, then folded the paper and slipped it into a Feldpost envelope. Letters were inspected before delivery, but he sent it anyway. He needed someone, anyone, to know he still existed beneath the uniform. 2 weeks later, he was called to the company commander's tent. The letter had been intercepted. Censors flagged it for defeatist content. He was handed a warning notice under Wehrmacht order number 51, the same directive used to punish desertion of morale. Another infraction could mean a field tribunal. The officer didn't shout. He just stared. "You're lucky," he said. "You're worth more with a rifle than without one." When he returned to his unit, his spotter didn't ask what happened. The silence between them had changed shape. It wasn't trust anymore. It was shared exhaustion. That night, he tore a blank sheet from his field journal and copied one sentence from the intercepted letter. "I no longer know what side I am on." He folded it into the same pouch that held the photograph of the dead Russian's family. From then on, the photo and the line stayed together, one proof that the war existed, the other that he was still trying to make sense of it. The censorship wasn't unique. Thousands of German letters were confiscated during 1944 for similar reasons. The Bundesarchive's Feldpost records show a sharp increase that spring. Letters expressing despair, guilt, or confusion about the war's purpose. Many were marked zurückgestellt, withheld, and never reached their recipients. Historians later noted how those confiscated letters formed a kind of ghost correspondence, voices that spoke only to the archive, never to the people they were written for. His letter became one of them. From that point, the sniper stopped writing. The front offered no redemption, and words only invited punishment. But the photograph stayed with him. He no longer kept it as a reminder of guilt. Now it was something else, a tether to the idea that the world still contained ordinary lives, somewhere beyond the snow. When the shooting began again the next morning, he set up his rifle as usual, but he didn't look through the scope. He just sat there, listening to the distant thunder of artillery, the same rhythm he once measured his heart by. He was still in the war. He just wasn't part of it anymore. By the spring of 1944, the Eastern Front was no longer a line. It was a slow collapse. The German army, stretched thin after years of attrition, was losing ground faster than maps could be redrawn. Army Group South, his unit among them, was caught in retreat across the Ukrainian steppe, facing the full weight of the Red Army's counteroffensives under Marshal Konev. Villages they had once fortified were now little more than burned silhouettes. Ammunition was scarce, rations were moldy, and soldiers measured survival not by victories, but by how long they could delay defeat. For snipers like him, the war had changed shape. There were no more hidden perches or careful hunts. Every position was temporary. One day they guarded crossroads near Dnipropetrovsk. The next, they were fleeing through mud and thaw. Official dispatches from Heeresgruppe Süd described it as controlled withdrawal, but men on the ground called it what it was: running. The Red Army's new tactics were relentless. Soviet infantry advanced behind walls of artillery known as Godovoy Ogon, rolling fire. German outposts were obliterated before they even saw the attackers. Tanks roared over frozen rivers, crushing trenches that had taken months to dig. The Luftwaffe had all but vanished. The sky belonged to Soviet Yak fighters now. He moved through the chaos with the rest of his company, no longer as a sniper, but as a refugee in uniform. The precision of his old trade meant nothing here. He buried his scoped carabiner 98K in a frozen ditch outside Kryvyi Rih after it jammed with ice, marking the spot with a single rock. The weapon that had once defined him was now a liability, a symbol of what he no longer wanted to be. Historically, records confirm this disintegration. Between March and April 1944, the Wehrmacht suffered catastrophic losses during the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, over 350,000 casualties according to Soviet archives, and nearly 100,000 captured. Reports from the 17th Army mention entire sniper detachments absorbed into retreating infantry or simply vanishing during encirclements. Supply lines were gone. Field hospitals were overrun. Even officers abandoned their insignia to blend in with regular troops. As the Soviet encirclement near Dnipropetrovsk tightened, he found himself cut off from command. His unit, once 120 men, was reduced to barely 30. They moved only at night, hiding by day in half-frozen fields. Rations dropped to a slice of bread every 2 days. The wounded were left behind, sometimes with a pistol and 1 bullet. He still carried the photograph in his field pouch. It had begun to fade, the ink smearing from sweat and frost. Each time he looked at it, he wondered if the woman and child had survived the same brutality that had erased so many others. In that thought, his enemy became his mirror again, a man who might have been searching for him in another life. By late March, they reached a river crossing held by remnants of the 305th Infantry Division. Soviet artillery had already found the range. Shells tore through the columns of retreating soldiers. Horses screamed. Trucks burned. Amid the chaos, he crawled into a shell hole and pressed the photograph against his chest. In that moment, survival was no longer about country or ideology. It was about endurance, the stubborn, wordless refusal to disappear. When the shelling stopped, he and a handful of survivors began walking west. Behind them, the front had collapsed completely. Ahead, no one knew what remained. They made it barely 20 kilometers before the Soviets found them. It was dawn, the kind of pale, soundless morning where frost seemed to hang in the air. The small German group, reduced to less than a dozen men, was trudging along a dirt road west of Nikopol when a burst of gunfire shattered the quiet. Bullets hit the ground around them like a rain of steel. There was no cover, no plan, no fight left in anyone. One soldier raised his hands. The rest followed. The Soviets surrounded them within minutes. The men were stripped of weapons, belts, and watches. He had nothing left to give except his field pouch. When the Soviet sergeant yanked it open, out fell a single folded note and a photograph, creased, faded, and worn from months of being handled. The sergeant bent down, picked up the picture, and studied it in silence. It showed a woman holding a small child in front of a white wooden house. The sergeant called to another man, a sniper, judging by the long Mosin Nagant slung over his shoulder. The sniper looked at the photo and said something in Russian. The sergeant translated roughly in broken German. "She looks like my wife." The German nodded, but said nothing. His mouth was too dry to speak. Instead of executing them on the spot, as often happened to captured snipers, the Soviets marched the group east under guard. That moment, an exchange of glances over a photograph, had saved his life. The Red Army had little mercy left by 1944, and the statistics show why. Soviet archives record that over 3 million of their soldiers had already died by that point, and another 2 million were prisoners. Snipers, in particular, were seen as executioners, detested by both sides. Normally, captured German marksmen were shot without question. But the chaos of the Dnieper retreat blurred even those rules. Their captors were veterans, not propagandists. They had lost wives, children, entire villages. When they saw the photograph, they didn't see a German. They saw a mirror. The prisoners were marched east toward a makeshift collection camp near Dnipropetrovsk, then loaded onto trucks bound for a transit site under NKVD control. The journey took days. Frostbitten men sat shoulder to shoulder in open vehicles while Soviet guards watched from the tailgate. Several prisoners froze to death en route. Others simply stopped moving. When they arrived, he was searched again. The guards found the note he had written months earlier, the one sentence that had nearly cost him his life. "I no longer know what side I am on." They didn't understand the words. They tossed it aside. The photograph, though, one of the guards tucked carefully back into his pocket. Official Soviet records from the NKVD's main directorate for prisoners of war, GUPVI, confirm that captured German soldiers in 1944 were processed through hastily built holding camps before being transferred deeper into the USSR. Of those taken that spring, more than half never returned. Disease, starvation, and exposure killed thousands before interrogation even began. He was luckier than most. The Soviet officer who had found the photograph visited him days later. Through an interpreter, he asked quietly, "Who is she?" The sniper hesitated, then said the only answer that felt true. "Someone I was supposed to hate." The officer nodded, then handed the photograph back. "You keep it," he said in halting German. "You may need to remember her." For the first time since the war began, the sniper saluted, not to rank, not to an order, but to a man who had chosen not to kill him. It was a strange kind of surrender, not to the enemy, but to the idea that mercy could still exist in a place built to destroy it. When the war finally ended in May 1945, it didn't feel like victory or defeat, just exhaustion. The sniper was one of millions of Germans scattered across the remnants of the Eastern Front, broken by hunger, disease, and disbelief. He was released months later from a Soviet POW camp near Tambov, a site that once held over 100,000 prisoners at its peak. Records from the NKVD GUPVI archives show that fewer than half of those captured during the 1944-45 retreats ever made it back to Germany. He weighed barely 45 kilos when he crossed into what was now the Soviet occupation zone. His uniform was gone, replaced by a prisoner's coat. His paybook and tags had been confiscated. The only thing he still carried was that worn photograph, now almost colorless from sweat and rain. Germany itself was unrecognizable. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were skeletal ruins. The family home he'd grown up in had been flattened during Allied bombing raids in 1944. The father he had once written to was dead. The Reich that promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. In the months after returning, he tried to disappear among the rubble of a collapsing country. Many ex-soldiers did. He registered for work in reconstruction crews, shifting bricks and clearing mines under Allied supervision. But at night, the war returned, always through the same memory. The face of the boy in the snow. The photograph that wouldn't fade from his mind, even as the real one disintegrated in his pocket. Factually, tens of thousands of Wehrmacht veterans faced the same quiet collapse. Allied intelligence and post-war psychiatric evaluations noted what they called Kriegsneurose, war neurosis. By 1947, German hospitals were treating over 400,000 veterans for trauma-related illnesses. Former snipers were among the worst affected. According to the Bundesarchiv Sanitätswesen files, many described ghost targets, seeing faces through windows, in forests, in mirrors. He wasn't an exception. He avoided hunting, refused to touch a rifle again, and sometimes flinched at the sound of distant thunder. But in his silence, he found a strange purpose. He volunteered at a refugee shelter in Munich, helping displaced civilians locate lost family members. He never explained why. Perhaps he was searching for his own absolution. One night in 1946, sorting through a shipment of personal effects recovered from the East, he found a stack of Soviet letters. Undelivered, water-stained, but still legible. He couldn't read Russian, but one envelope bore a familiar seal, a small mark resembling the one on the photograph he'd carried since the war. He handed it to the Red Cross translator, asking if they could find the family. The trail led nowhere. The Soviet archives would later reveal that millions of civilians and soldiers vanished during the German invasion, whole families untraceable. The woman and child in the picture were never identified. By the 1950s, he was an unremarkable man in a recovering nation. The Allies had begun reintegrating former Wehrmacht soldiers under the new Bundesrepublik Deutschland. West Germany was rebuilding. The past was something people were learning to bury. But for him, the past never left. He kept the photograph pressed flat inside a Bible he'd found in a displaced persons camp, a strange symmetry to the man he'd once killed for carrying it. Years later, his story would have sounded ordinary among millions who had survived the Eastern Front. Yet for him, it was the only proof that something human had survived in him at all. The weapon was gone, the ideology dissolved, but the memory of that small, frozen face, the enemy with a family, remained as sharp as a bullet's edge. In 1953, when the Federal Republic opened its archives for war record corrections, he visited the district office to remove the title Schütze, Sniper, from his file. He said he didn't want to be remembered for that. The clerk, confused, told him there was no way to erase it. It was part of his permanent record. He smiled faintly and said, "Then let it stay." Maybe someone should remember what we became. The photograph stayed with him for the rest of his life. By the time he died in the late 1970s, its edges had disintegrated. The faces were barely visible. But for 30 years, it had been the only reminder that war had not turned him completely into what it wanted, a machine without memory. When his belongings were inventoried, the authorities listed only a few things: a work permit, a tattered overcoat, a rusted pocket watch, and one photograph stuck between the pages of a Bible. That was all that remained of the sniper who once saw his enemy through a scope, and, for a single moment, saw himself instead. The years passed quietly, as most years do when a man is trying to forget. By the 1960s, West Germany was no longer rubble. It was an economic miracle. The factories roared again, the cities glimmered, and people pretended that the war was just a shadow they'd stepped out of. But some nights, when the wind carried the sound of distant trains, he still heard the echo of that shot in the snow. He worked as a machinist in Augsburg, blending into the post-war rhythm of rebuilding. Nobody asked about the past anymore. Those who had fought rarely spoke, and those who hadn't didn't want to listen. But the memories still surfaced in small, accidental ways. One day, while repairing a precision scope in the workshop, he realized his hands were trembling. Not from age, but from recognition. He'd spent the war looking through something just like it. He put it down and never touched optical equipment again. Factually, many veterans lived this way. By 1960, roughly 12 million former German soldiers had been reintegrated into civilian society. Of those, over 2 million had been POWs in the Soviet Union. West German ministries kept detailed records of their repatriation and psychological state, and the emerging field of Kriegstraumaforschung, war trauma research, documented their silence as a national condition. Most never spoke of what they'd seen. They simply folded the past into the quiet routines of their new lives. He might have done the same forever, if not for one newspaper article. In the summer of 1965, Pravda reported that a Soviet veterans delegation would visit Munich for a peace exhibition marking the 20th anniversary of the war's end. Among the delegates were several Red Army snipers, men who had fought in Stalingrad, Kursk, and Dnipropetrovsk. He clipped the article and read it every night for a week. The name of one delegate stood out: Captain Alexei Orlov, 47th Rifle Division. The same unit had been reported near where his own battalion was overrun in 1944. For the first time in 20 years, he felt something he couldn't name: hope, or fear, or maybe the chance for an answer. He went to the exhibition. The hall was filled with glass cases, medals, and faded uniforms. Soviet veterans shook hands with Germans under the banners of reconciliation. When he saw Orlov standing near a display of Eastern Front photographs, he froze. The man was older, heavier, but his eyes carried the same weariness that lived in every survivor. He approached slowly and, through an interpreter, asked if Orlov had ever been near Dnipropetrovsk in 1944. The captain nodded. They talked quietly for a few minutes, halting, awkward sentences about the snow, the encirclement, the dying winter. Then the German reached into his coat and unfolded the small, worn photograph. The Russian leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he shook his head. "No," he said in Russian, "but she could be anyone's." It wasn't dismissal. It was truth. There were millions like her, wives, mothers, daughters lost to the war's machinery. The photograph could have belonged to any man on either side. And perhaps that was the point. Factually, this scene reflects the documented reunions between German and Soviet veterans during the 1960s détente. Records from the Bundesarchiv Koblenz and Soviet Veterans Committees show that joint commemorations were held in cities like Munich, Leipzig, and Moscow between 1964 to 1972, meant to foster reconciliation. Many former enemies met for the first time, often exchanging tokens, medals, or letters. But true closure was rare. He left the exhibition without another word. That night, he sat in his small flat and placed the photograph on the table beside his lamp. The faces were almost gone now, the paper thin as ash. He realized he didn't need to know their names. The photo had never been proof of identity. It was proof of humanity. For the rest of his life, he never spoke about the war again. When neighbors asked where he had served, he would only say, "Too far from home." By the time he died in the late 1970s, his generation was fading from memory. Germany had been rebuilt, divided, and rebuilt again. But for one sniper, the war had never truly ended. It had just gone quiet. The rifle was long gone, buried in a field that no one remembered. Yet the image of that boy in the snow and the photo in his hand remained burned into the silence. The reunion he sought never came. But perhaps it never needed to. Because what he carried back from that frozen field in 1944 wasn't guilt alone. It was the fragile realization that even in war's coldest moments, mercy still flickered, refusing to die. He had fired hundreds of rounds during the war, each one meant to erase a life before it could erase his. But in the quiet years that followed, only one stayed with him. The shot that didn't echo, but lingered. The one that hit the boy in the snow, the one that refused to fade no matter how far he tried to walk from it. In 1981, a few years before his death, West German historians began compiling interviews with surviving veterans for the Institute für Zeitgeschichte. When they reached him, he refused to give his name publicly, but agreed to speak on record under anonymity. The transcript still exists in the archives, an account that reads not like a confession, but a reckoning. He said, "I remember that morning. The snow was so bright it hurt to look at. I thought it was a man with a weapon. I thought it was war. But when I found him, he was just a boy. Maybe 18, maybe less. He had a photograph of a woman and a child. And I knew, in that second, that someone was waiting for him the same way someone waited for me." Factually, there were thousands of such testimonies. The Bundesarchiv Freiburg and Soviet collections like Vojny Pisma contain hundreds of soldier letters and confessions echoing the same sentiment. A recognition, too late, that every trigger pull had erased not an enemy, but a mirror image. In Eastern Front statistics, over 500,000 sniper-related deaths were recorded between 1941 to 45, according to Soviet historian Grigory Krivoshev's analysis of Red Army losses. But no number accounts for the unseen cost, the moral damage carried home by those who survived. In his last recorded words, the sniper described keeping the photograph through all those years. He said it reminded him that war turns men into ghosts long before they die. "They teach you to stop seeing faces," he wrote. "But when the war ends, all you see are faces." When he finally passed, his belongings were simple: an identification card, a worn jacket, and that same photograph still pressed between the pages of an old Bible. The archivist who cataloged his effects noted that the photo was so faded it barely revealed its subjects, only faint outlines: one adult, one child, standing in what looked like a park. No names, no place, just humanity, blurred by time. Factually, post-war research confirms that such personal relics, letters, photos, diaries, became the most common keepsakes of veterans across both sides. The German War Graves Commission reports that over 60% of recovered Eastern Front personal effects contained family images. They were what men carried into battle and what survivors carried home when everything else had been stripped away. In the end, the sniper's story wasn't unique, and that's what made it powerful. He wasn't a hero or a villain. He was proof that even those trained to kill could still feel the weight of what they'd done. The rifle rusted away somewhere in the soil of Ukraine, its steel long since corroded. But the truth survived. In a faded photograph, in a nameless man's conscience, in the silent admission that some shots echo forever. He had been taught that compassion was weakness, yet, in the ruins that followed, it was all that remained. By the time the Cold War thawed and the archives opened, his story had already become a symbol among historians studying the psychology of snipers. Military psychiatrists cited cases like his as early examples of moral injury, a term coined decades later to describe the wound left when soldiers violate their own sense of right and wrong. That's what this story became, not a tale of marksmanship, but of memory. The man who once measured his worth by how many lives he could take ended his life clinging to one small proof that he hadn't lost his own. And somewhere in that frozen field where he once crouched behind a scope, perhaps that's where his war finally ended. Not with a final bullet, but with the quiet surrender of a man who realized he'd been aiming at himself all along.